they've burned all of the Syrian crops. Now they're introducing genetically modified seed to replace those crops. You know, people need to understand the deviousness and the barbarism of these multi-spectrum wars. They're waged on every single level. But under Biden, I think it's become much more apparent that the US is effectively working with ISIS. It's not fighting ISIS.
Vanessa Beeley, welcome to the show.
Hi, Primo. Thanks so much for inviting me on. It's good to finally catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been wanting to have you on this show for a while to discuss Western interference in Syria. And you recently wrote an article that I wanted to go over. However, I did also want to talk about the recent uncovering that there was war crimes committed in 2019. This was reported by the New York Times this past weekend. And in 2019, the United States bombed 80 people in Syria. And the article is a little interesting, as posted by Reuters, reporting on what the New York Times wrote. So Reuters reports, in a statement on Saturday, Central Command reiterated the account it gave the newspapers that 80 people were killed in the airstrikes, including 16 Islamic State fighters and 4 civilians. The military said it was unclear if the other 60 people were civilians, partly because women and children could have been combatants. Vanessa, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on this report and, again, just what recently has been happening in Syria.
Well, I mean, in my view, the entire regime change war has been a war crime from start to finish. It's an unlawful military intervention, both direct and by proxy. You know, this isn't the first time that the US has committed serious supreme war crimes in Syria during the so-called liberation of Raqqa in very much the same area. The US used more artillery than was used in the campaigns in Vietnam to basically pulverize Raqqa city. Using the Kurdish Contra proxies, they deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, residential homes, hospitals, on the claim that ISIS were occupying these buildings. The US has used depleted uranium in Syria. All of this is documented. In 2016, the US coalition, and that included the UK and even Denmark, carried out an attack, a deliberate attack against Syrian Arab army positions that were defending Deir ez-Zor, the city of Deir ez-Zor, against ISIS, and allowed ISIS at that point to take control of a strategic mountain in the area from which they could attack the city, which at that point was besieged by ISIS and contained thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of civilians who were being starved and were under threat from the ISIS terrorist groups. So, you know, apart from the fact that, of course, the US has been sponsoring, financing, arming and equipping the armed groups that have carried out multiple atrocities and war crimes in Syria since 2011, I think it's interesting timing that this particular war crime is being made public now, as following on, of course, from the revelations about the corruption at the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Use, that has been totally discredited by its untruthful reporting on the alleged Duma chemical attack in April 2018. We're seeing a degree of normalization with President Assad since Dada in the south of Syria was re-liberated or reclaimed by Damascus and by the, reintegrated into Syrian territory in August, September of this year. So I think it's kind of also indicative of that level of normalization. I think we're going to see more of this. We've seen a lot of kind of what I call gritted teeth reports in media outlets like Newsweek, Foreign Policy, talking about this normalization, accepting the fact that after 10 years of war and economic sanctions and political diplomatic warfare against this country, They haven't succeeded. In the elections of May of this year, the president was re-elected with a landslide victory, and people can, dismiss that victory. They can talk about it being undemocratic, but I would challenge anyone to tell me the last time that the US had a fair and democratic election, or for that matter, the UK. Democracy is a myth that is imposed upon countries like Syria in order to carry out these military exercises and campaigns to topple regimes or governments that don't comply with US foreign policy. And the people of Syria in May of this year went out on the streets and made it very clear that they consider the West to be irrelevant and that they will determine their own future. And at the moment, their future is with President Assad and the government that is now in place.
So again, I think it's important for all Westerners to understand the history of Syria and how we got here. And you recently wrote an article, 75 Years and Counting, which goes over all of the different interference that the US and UK have, and France have played in Syria over the years. So just starting at the beginning, or back in 1947, following World War II, could you explain what the Pan-Arab movement was and how the initial Syrian government was set up after World War II?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the Pan-Arab movement was to unify the Arab states, to make them a powerful bloc to prevent imperialist or neocolonialist influence and interference in state affairs, and also to take control, of course, to nationalize resources, which is anathema to the US foreign policy generally, because the US works on the basis of plundering and taking control, either violently or through economic means, economic pressure, the resources of target countries. And effectively, it's piracy. And so the Pan-Arab movement was a policy to prevent the ability of the US to do so. And Syria and Egypt, of course, post-Second World War, were the United Arab Republic, at that time the UAR, were pushing hard for this kind of Pan-Arabism. Post-Second World War, that also included in 1946 Syria's finally taking its independence from the French mandate. The French mandate, of course, was set up by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when effectively the then neo-colonialist powers handed Syria to the French, post-Ottoman Empire, of course. And in 1946, Syria basically took its independence, and in 1947, the CIA was created, which was effectively a rebranding of a number of previous intelligence agencies. And from that date onwards, Syria has been plagued by a series of regime change operations, clandestine military operations, black ops, CIA interventions of one form or another, sanctions, pressure being brought to bear by the US, the UK, France, as you mentioned, leading up to 2011. And, my point is that we can't, since 2011, we can't make sweeping statements about Syria being a police state, Assad being a monster, as Noam Chomsky did fairly recently in an interview with yourself. But he's not the only one on the left who is making these kind of utterances, unless we're prepared to analyze and discuss the context of where Syria is now and why. And when you look at that history, when you look at only 75 years, it actually goes back much further. I mean, even in 1945, the French, prior to Syria's independence, attacked Damascus, killing more than 400 civilians and military in an attempt
to prevent. This was in response to an uprising against the French?
Yeah, exactly. And I think my date's right. There was a previous one in 1925. Course, which was equally put down. So I think what I tried to do with this article was to present to people the history of the CIA interference in Syria, which has been at various stages. You know, it's kind of peaked at various stages when the government in situ has effectively not complied with US policy. I mean, for example, from 1946 onwards, probably the strongest driver for CIA intervention was what they perceived to be a pro-communist stance or policy within Syria. And actually, according to Peter Ford, who's the former British ambassador to Syria 2003 to 2006, the anti-Soviet or anti-Russian policy is part of a very vindictive policy, particularly by the UK against Syria, because it's the Russian influence which has created the hostility both in the US and the UK, to a lesser extent in France, in my opinion.
Well, again, it has to do with natural resources as well, right? And having pipelines and oil that the U.S. and the West want to get a hold of, right? And I believe that was even the impetus for the first CIA-backed coup in Syria, was the fact that the initial Syrian government did not want to cooperate with the exploitation of Syria's oil, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Shukri al-Kuwatli, who was the president that actually had to go through a number of coups by the CIA because he was overthrown. They brought in the pro-CIA military president, who was then overthrown in a coup led by the Syrian people because he was a tyrant. Funnily enough, of course, the CIA never choose someone that is going to sort of be beneficial to the people. It's only going to be beneficial to US interests, right? And so Kuwatli was re-elected in 1955. I have to check myself because there are simply so many CIA interventions. It's hard to keep up with them. When I was actually writing this, I was like, even my own mind was blown at the connections and how it led so neatly up to 2011. And it helps us to understand why 2011 happened. But yeah, I mean, you know, nationalization of national resources is something that the US does not allow in any independent state. And then financial independence, alliance with its enemies in the region, or rather the enemies of Israel in the region, namely Iran and Hezbollah, are also not to be allowed. And of course, Kuwatli, right from the beginning, was against the creation of the State of Israel. He was against the Truman Doctrine of settlement of Jewish refugees in Palestine. But I think what's interesting, and I've just got this up in front of me, was at this time, in 1949, when there was a CIA coup against Syria, Dean Hinton, who was then a US State Department official, made the statement saying that he wanted to go on record saying that this is the stupidest, most irresponsible action a diplomatic mission like ours could get itself involved in. And that emphasis here, we've started a series of these things that will never end. So that was back in 1946. Fast forward to 2011, and of course that's exactly what we're seeing, or have been seeing, for the last 10 years.
So in your article, you also go over the Arab-Israeli wars of the 1960s. Could you just discuss that a little bit? What was the impact on Syria of the Arab-Israeli wars?
Well, in 1967, that of course was when the Golan territories, a lot of people call it the Golan Heights, but it's actually more than just the Golan Heights. It's the entire territory of the Golan. And we shouldn't forget that the Golan provides Israel with 30% of its water supply. So when we're talking about resources, it's not only about oil, it's also, of course, about water and minerals and so on. And in 1967, it was always considered that the claiming of Golan was kind of happenstance, that it came about as part of the war, that Israel just happened to annex this territory. A recent document leak in 2021, which I talk about in the article, shows that the seizing of West Bank from Jordan, the Sinai from Egypt and the Golan territories from Syria were part of a military strategy that had been decided long before the 1967 war. So this is very interesting because it shows that even as far back as pre-1967, Israel was looking at the partitioning and the seizing of territories in Syria.
In regards to Bashar al-Assad's father, could you discuss how he came to power and what Syria was like under his administration?
Yeah, I mean, Hafez al-Assad came to power as leader of the Ba'ath Party. He then became president. Of course, as soon as Hafez al-Assad came in, and he was strongly socialist, actually, which again is something that, I mean, the Ba'ath Party policy is a socialist policy: free healthcare, free education. Of course, he was interested in the nationalization of resources, just as prior presidents that had been targeted by the CIA were. He was an advocate of pan-Arabism, an ally of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, etc. And of course, as soon as he came to power, then we started to see the ramping up of CIA interference in Syria, leading to the late 70s when there was a CIA weaponization of the Muslim Brotherhood, exactly what we've seen in 2011, to overthrow the government of Hafez al-Assad. And basically the Muslim Brotherhood then led a campaign of suicide bombings. They massacred Alawite cadets in the Aleppo military academy. The interesting story about that, and I've spoken to people who were actually there at the time, the Sunni Muslim cadets who were told to leave, they would be spared. They refused to leave and they were massacred alongside their Alawite companions or comrades. And so they carried out a campaign of attacks on civilians, on military, and so on. And again, of course, these attacks are much downplayed in Western media. They're not really talked about. Of course, what is talked about is the final putting down of the insurgents, which was backed and financed and equipped by the CIA and by the US alliance in 1982 in Hama, to the northwest of Damascus. Claims are that more than 10,000 were killed. The numbers that I hear here from official statistics are around 2,000. And of course, after this, attempts were made by the Syrian government to reintegrate the Muslim Brotherhood factions into Syrian society, into Syrian institutions, into Syrian governmental offices, etc. In a lot of people's views, they were too soft because, of course, the empowerment of the Muslim Brotherhood post-1982 led to a further attempted coup in 1986. But of course, then it also empowered them in 2011 to lead the CIA-backed insurgents here in Syria that has destabilized the country for 10 years.
So could you give a little bit more history on the Muslim Brotherhood? What exactly is this group and why would the West seemingly support them?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood, if I remember correctly, was founded in Egypt in 1936, and the British had a hand in this. As of course, they had a hand in the creation of the House of Saud, that would then govern Saudi Arabia, and also be weaponized by the neo-colonialist nations like the US and the UK, as we're seeing now in Yemen, and we've seen in Syria, in Libya, etc. And the Muslim Brotherhood is described as the political arm of Islam. In reality, as a very dear friend of mine in British politics described them, he said, well, they're terrorists in suits. The Muslim Brotherhood is an extremist sectarian faction of Sunni Islam. yes, it's true that it's political, but its political nature means that it is a power that is weaponized by the West when they want to topple a secular progressive government, as they have tried to do in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood is the preferred alternative because effectively what the West wants to do is to take these nations back to the Dark Ages. They don't want a country to be progressive and independent and to be reformist, actually, in any way, unless that reform, of course, complies with their policy. So imposing a Muslim Brotherhood government in place of a secular progressive government serves both Israel and US interests, and UK. When I'm talking about US, I'm always including UK and EU interests in the region because they're intrinsically tied together. You can't separate them. I mean, the UK has been instrumental, particularly through its intelligence agencies, in waging this war, both on the media front and the military front and the political front against Syria.
So you mentioned the Ba'ath Party. I think that a lot of Americans, when they hear the Ba'ath Party, they think of Iraq and the administration of Saddam Hussein. Could you discuss the relationship between Syria and Iraq over the years, and in particular, Iraq under the rule of Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, I mean, Saddam Hussein and Hafez al-Assad were not friends. I mean, Hafez al-Assad considered that Saddam Hussein conducted opportunistic relations, let's say, with the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. He was instrumentalized, or allowed himself to be instrumentalized, by the US in the war against Iran. He used US supplied and approved chemical weapons against Iranians previously, of course, during that war. But Syria at the same time agreed with the ousting of Iraq from Kuwait. But in the 2003 US intervention or invasion of Iraq, which we know to have been pre-planned according to documents that were released showing that Blair and Bush were planning this invasion long before 2003, at that point, both Saddam Hussein and Iran objected to the invasion of Iraq, even though it would have effectively, or it did, remove someone that was not an ally of theirs. So the history between Syria and Iraq, particularly from a Ba'ath Party perspective, is a troubled one. But I would say that the model of Ba'ath Party socialism was more adhered to in Syria than in Iraq.
Again, I'm just wondering, I guess, because both were pan-Arab states and both had the Ba'ath Party in power, when was the falling out between Syria and Iraq? Was it when Saddam Hussein came to power, or when he started collaborating with the United States?
I'm not sure there was ever a sort of, I could be wrong. I don't think there was ever a public falling out, because Hafez al-Assad was very careful to maintain diplomatic relations with Iraq. It's a neighboring country. But certainly, as I say, they objected to the involvement of Saddam Hussein in the war, or the US-led war against Iran. And they objected in the occupation of Kuwait, or the invasion of Kuwait. So I think Syria maintained a stance that was very much adhering to international law. You know, this is an important point to make. There weren't personal enmities were not brought into it. Syria very much disagreed with the violation of international law, and it stood by that. And you know, I think when it came to 2003, they were very vocally against the US invasion of Iraq, and for that reason, of course, they came under very savage sanctions under the Bush regime.
Around the turn of the century, that's also when Bashar al-Assad came to power. Could you discuss how his government is a little bit different, or how he as a person is a little bit different than his father?
Actually, I think a lot of people would be quite surprised that the one criticism of Bashar al-Assad that has come from the Syrian people during this 10-year war is that he's too soft, which kind of flies in the face of the narratives that are being peddled in Western media that they're receiving, of course, from CIA and MI6 in order to sustain another regime change war in Syria. As soon as Bashar al-Assad came to power, of course, he was not destined to be the president of Syria. His brother, Bashar al-Assad, was supposed to inherit the presidency from his father. He was killed in a car crash, and Bashar al-Assad stepped up to the plate in 2000 after his father's death. But from the date that he took power, of course, then we went straight into 9/11, and Bush then used this as a pretext to launch the so-called war on terror, which many would describe as the war of terror, which then, of course, led to the invasion of Iraq. And post 9/11, we know from the communications that were released in the Chilcot report that investigated the weapons of mass destruction hoax that, if you like, enabled the invasion of Iraq, the communications between then Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, and George Bush, that demonstrated the fact that they would attempt a different relationship with Syria. So in other words, they were going to try and bring Bashar al-Assad over to their way of thinking. What would that mean? That would mean accepting the Qatari-Turkey pipeline that was backed by the United States. It would mean distancing himself from the Palestinian cause, from Hezbollah, from Iran. It would mean relinquishing his financial independence. Syria was completely financially independent as a country. And of course, ultimately, Bashar al-Assad refused all of these conditions to be allowed into the Western camp. In fact, he turned down the Qatari pipeline, which was proposed in 2000 when he came to power. He turned it down in 2009. And in 2009, according to Roland Dumas, the then French foreign minister, he was approached by British officials telling him that they were planning to enable an armed insurrection in Syria, and that they wanted him to come on board with that. So that was directly lined up with his refusal to go along with the Qatari pipeline on the basis that he was remaining loyal to Russia in this perspective, because the Iranian pipeline, of course, was at that time backed by Russia. And what's important to understand here, had the Qatari pipeline gone ahead, then of course that would have given Sunni Muslim, the Gulf states, supremacy over the oil economy, the petrodollar, in the region and in Europe. Assad, favoring the Russian-Iranian option, of course, was giving it to what is perceived as the Shiite contingent. So, there are so many aspects leading to what happened in 2011 that are very important to look at and to understand.
Yeah, I mean, the period after 9/11 was kind of strange looking at the West's relationship with Bashar al-Assad, because you had public and private statements that, the West wanted to overthrow him. And you saw this, not just in the private communications between U.S. government officials, but also, I mean, there was a interview that Assad did with CNN where they essentially said, we're looking to overthrow you soon, which is a little bizarre.
Mr. President, you know the rhetoric of regime change is headed towards you from the United States. They are actively looking for a new Syrian leader. They're granting visas and visits to Syrian opposition politicians. They're talking about isolating you diplomatically and perhaps a coup d'etat or your regime crumbling. What are you thinking about that?
I feel very confident for one reason, because I was made in Syria, I wasn't made in the United States, so I'm not worried. This is Syrian decision, should be made by the Syrian people, nobody else in this world. So we don't discuss it in Syria.
What would happen, do you think, if there was an alternative to you? Who is the alternative to you?
Could be any Syrian, any national Syria, and we have a lot. I'm not the only person who is eligible to be president. We have a lot of Syrians, so we don't have any problem about that. But no Syrian would be allowed to be president if he's made anywhere outside our borders. This is a Syrian principle.
At the same time, you had Assad visiting with the Queen of England. You had, and something that I always thought was strange about the criticism of Tulsi Gabbard going to Syria was that around this time, Nancy Pelosi was meeting with Assad. John Kerry had dinner with Assad. Yeah. So it was this very strange kind of extending of an olive branch, seemingly, but also like threatening to destroy Syria. Could you just speak to this a little bit? I mean, I imagine from the Syrian government's perspective, this must have been quite odd.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Around 2002, he met the Queen. Tony Blair was talking about bestowing an honorary knighthood on him. And I mean, I would say even leading up to 2011, there was a book by an American academic, David Leff, the Bashar al-Assad, the New Lion of Damascus, and I thoroughly recommend that everybody looks it up and reads it, because again, this was part of the kind of the courting procedure. This was an academic who shadowed Bashar al-Assad for I think around 2 years before writing a book about a very reformist, a very progressive president who was, you know, a good ally for the democratic West, etc. Of course, post 2012, he wrote a book that did a complete U-turn on that characterization of Assad. But even while Assad was being courted, of course, there were, let's say, undercurrents of threat, as you rightly say. I mean, I can't find the actual quote, but Blair was basically saying, you know, as far as Iran and Syria are concerned, when we come to weapons of mass destruction, if they don't deal with it, then of course they'll be isolated or worse. And of course, we know in Syria, the weapons of mass destruction is the chemical weapons. The weapon of mass destruction narrative that was used to destroy Iraq has been converted into the chemical weapons narrative that is, since 2018, has been severely discredited and demonstrated to be another weapons of mass destruction construct to maintain the criminalization and demonization of the Syrian government. And 2003, of course, and this is where the threat, in my view, started to kind of come in, because probably Assad wasn't entirely towing the line. 2004, you had, at that point, BBC Media Action started to, let's say, scout for opposition, for viable opposition inside Syria, under the pretext of providing media assistance, etc. I've actually had a fairly gladiatorial exchange with Juliet Harkin, who was the former BBC Media Action project manager on Twitter, where she tried to defend her actions and said that, you know, BBC Media Action has nothing to do with regime change or infiltration. But of course, that's proved wrong by their history. So in 2004, the BBC were, in my view, sent to scout for viable opposition members that they could infiltrate and influence in order to turn them against the Syrian government. And I also know from ministers either current ministers or spokespeople of the government, etc., officials from the institutions, that they were being approached from around this time onwards with financial incentivization to come over to the Western side. So this is, this is nothing new. The former foreign minister was offered multiple bribes. Buthaina Shaban, who's the media advisor to the presidency, was offered multiple bribes, even prior to 2011, to come over to the dark side, to the side of the US coalition. And in 2004, so at the same time as the BBC was scouting for opposition, President Bush imposed severe sanctions on Syria on the basis that they were supporting terrorism, which included, of course, Hezbollah and Hamas. Which were the biggest threat, or the biggest nemesis for Israel in the region. Many people believe that these sanctions were also punishment for Syria's not supporting or opposing the war against Iraq.
Well, one thing that I think is forgotten in the United States is how strong the anti-war sentiment of the mid-2000s was, because you had massive demonstrations around the world, really, prior to the invasion of Iraq. But in 2005, 2006, you would see hundreds of thousands of people protesting. Cindy Sheehan, she made a lot of headlines in her protesting George W. Bush. The Democrats ran on 2001 in 2006 and 2008 by running against the Iraq war and pretending as though they were going to end the Iraq war. I know that in the lead up to the Iraq war, Wesley Clark said that he was shown a memo that we were going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. Obviously, that didn't come into full fruition, although we did bomb Libya and Syria. I guess I'm just wondering, do you think that that strong global anti-war sentiment against the neoconservatives and the Bush administration, do you think that prevented an invasion of Syria in the mid-2000s and perhaps other countries?
Well, that's an interesting question, not something that I've really thought about. I don't think so. I don't think it had any effect at that time, because I think at that time, looking at the emails and the communiques, I think the US and the UK thought that they could bring Bashar al-Assad over to their side. I think from around 2003, 2004, as I said, onwards, and as you said, I mean, there was that bizarre interview with Christiane Amanpour for CNN where she basically said, yeah, we're planning regime change. And not forgetting also in February of the same year, Rafiq Hariri was assassinated in Lebanon, which was then conveniently blamed on Syria and Hezbollah. And of course, no investigation into the covert operations carried out by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence. So I think no, because I think, I could be wrong, but I would say that because a lot of the building up to the war in 2011 was very much covert and very much clandestine. I mean, it wasn't launched with the chemical weapons attacks. It was launched as part of the Arab Spring. And I think, a lot of people, sadly, on the left were very confused by this entire Arab Spring. It's a clever concept because it fooled a lot of people on the left. So no, I would actually say, because a lot of it was not visible, I mean, you had, I suppose, in history, you had the Israeli clean break strategy, which was talking about using the invasion of Iraq to roll back Syria, weaken Syria. There were comments from US State Department officials, neocons, that the road to Damascus goes through Baghdad. So to some degree, the invasion of Iraq was an inevitable part of the eventual invasion of Syria. But I think at that point, they were probably hoping, from a brinkmanship perspective, that the invasion of Iraq might intimidate Syria enough to bring it to heel, to bring Bashar al-Assad to heel, and then they could incentivize and use a mixture of incentivization and coercion to bring the Syrian government into line, but it didn't work. And so I think from 2004 onwards, we started to see, you know, in 2006, there was the article in Time magazine called Syria in Bush's crosshairs. And even then it was talking about the fact that the Bush administration had been quietly nurturing individuals and organizations that might be effective in toppling the Syrian government. So I think from then onwards, we started to see, you know, the WikiLeaks released documents from the CIA in 2006, etc., demonstrating that, yeah, they were planning to again weaponize and instrumentalize the Muslim Brotherhood, as they have throughout the history of these CIA interventions. They did in 1949, in 1956 from memory, in 1978, in 1986. So, I mean, this is, in 1986, it was an almost textbook copy of what happened in 2011, as it was in 1978. So, but I think the left was caught unawares, to be honest. And actually, they've been kind of pretty disappointing for opposing the war against Syria in general. I think they've been very confused by the narratives that are coming out and are still coming out.
Well, I think that was one casualty of Obama getting elected, honestly, is just the anti-war movement dissolved. And as you mentioned, the support for the Arab Spring, this was prevalent in left-wing media. I mean, you could go back and watch Democracy Now! And how they covered what happened in Libya, and they were basically cheering on the rebels. So just going back to the Arab Spring, could you kind of just review what happened there? I think that the popular thought on this, and even among the left, is that you had people rising up against dictatorships in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, and that it was successful everywhere except Syria. Could you just kind of revisit this and kind of explain what happened in the Arab Spring?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend to everyone, I think it's a documentary made by Journeyman called The Revolution Business, which talks about how the Arab Spring was basically manufactured by Western intelligence agencies. I was in Egypt in 2012 and 2013 for extensive periods of time. I witnessed the snipers on the roofs. And by the way, it's worth noting that this policy is something that it's absolutely textbook CIA policy or what's the word? Tactics, right? We've seen it during the Arab Springs. We've seen it in Ukraine, of course, when Victoria Nuland famously visited. We saw the snipers on the roofs killing civilians in order to foment division and sectarian violence. But we've seen it most recently in the recent Tayouneh massacre in Lebanon, when snipers on the roofs were firing on Hezbollah and Amal members. Of course, those are both are allies in the resistance, in an area which historically it can be considered ripe for sectarian division, because the Hezbollah and Amal groups share an area with the Phalangists, which are basically Zionist Christian movement that carried out many of the massacres, of course, of the Palestinians, the Sabra Shatila and others in 1982. And strangely enough, this coincided with another visit of Victoria Nuland to Beirut. So I think, you know, sadly, the Arab Spring was engineered and orchestrated as it was in Syria. I mean, again, in Syria, if you speak to anyone, any Syrian on the streets here, particularly in Damascus, they will tell you, yeah, there were snipers on the roofs, they were picking off civilians and they were picking off the security forces. For the first 6 months of the protests, by the way, there was a ruling from the government that the security forces could not carry weapons. They could only carry batons and shields and the highest number of casualties, Kevork Almasyan of Syriana Analysis has done a number of videos showing clearly that the majority of the casualties were among the security forces, not among the protesters as claimed. And of course, if we go back to the early reporting on the Syrian Arab Spring, even if you like, US, NATO aligned media was saying, you know, the protests were barely visible. There were hardly any people on the streets, you know, so this was all being completely amplified and exaggerated by Western media. A number of journalists were producing reports saying, look, Bashar al-Assad has the support of his people. A YouGov poll in the UK in 2011 demonstrated that Bashar al-Assad, no, I think it was 2012, still had 55% support in the country. You know, so the Arab Spring, in my opinion, was entirely orchestrated in almost every country. I would say Tunisia might be the exception.
Well, I believe it was the first, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
possibly they were trying to capitalize off of what was happening.
Maybe, yeah. But yeah, I thoroughly recommend the Revolution Business. It's well worth watching, and it'll demonstrate the kind of intelligence outreach agencies like Optor, etc. And you know, we can't forget that there has been a recent leak of UK Foreign Office documents demonstrating the extent to which the British intelligence agencies were involved in manufacturing consent for this war. They were involved in providing media and PR support for the armed groups that include Al-Qaeda affiliates inside Syria. They spent millions on this. In 2006, the US and allies invested, I think, millions, if not billions, into a media outlet called Barada, which would produce anti-government propaganda even inside Syria, so leading up to 2011. And then, of course, you had Al Jazeera, you had the Saudi media, and you had Western media totally focused on producing the narratives that would provide the pretext for this war.
Yeah, and it's just odd that they kind of thought that, you know, the public would kind of go along with this, given, again, how strong the anti-war sentiment was for the Iraq war just a few years earlier, and just kind of, again, the massive backlash that you had against the Iraq war, and then kind of pushing the same exact narratives about gas attacks and weapons of mass destruction from the Syrian government. I believe around 2014, there was a strong push that essentially the U.S. government was about to announce that they were going to invade Syria or start bombing Damascus, but there was a pushback from the public, correct?
That was 2013. You mean after the first chemical weapon attack in Eastern Ghouta?
Correct. I believe John Kerry essentially went before Congress, stating that the U.S. government wanted to intervene more directly in Syria, but there was massive public backlash.
So what I would ask is, how are we to know? How are we to go home? I haven't had one person come up to me and say they're for this war. Not one person. We get calls by the thousands. Nobody's calling in favor of this war. I didn't meet one. I was home all month. I went to 40 cities. I didn't have one person come up and say, do they all agree it's a horrendous thing? Yes, we all agree that chemical attack's a horrendous thing, but people are not excited about getting involved. They also don't think it's going to work. And they're skeptical of what will occur with this.
Well, there was also in the UK at this point, because I remember, and interesting again to put this into context, in March 2013, there was a chemical weapon attack carried out by the terrorist groups. And of course, we have to remember that there is evidence that they were receiving what they needed to create sarin-based chemical weapons through the Turkish border prior to 2013. And we have to remember that Serena Shim, who's an American citizen but was working for Press TV at the time, basically exposed the fact that both terrorist weapons and chemical weapon ingredients were entering Syria through the Turkish border, supplied, of course, by NATO member states, the US, the UK, and the EU. And in March 2013, a chemical attack was carried out to the north of Aleppo by terrorist groups against Syrian civilians and soldiers. And for 6 months, the UN prevaricated and didn't come to investigate this attack, although they were requested to do so by the Syrian government. When they finally appeared, so they came to investigate a terrorist chemical attack, literally the day they landed in Damascus, lo and behold, there's a chemical attack allegedly carried out by the Syrian government that has, of course, been since discredited by a number of people, including Seymour Hersh and Carla Del Ponte, who famously said, you know, it must have come from a rebel area, etc. And there's been a recent, very in-depth report demonstrating that whatever chemicals were used by the Western-backed armed groups. I can't remember who published it, but I can give you the link afterwards. Yeah, you're right. At this point, there was calls for greater military intervention in Syria, and it was voted down in the UK. And as you rightly said, it was voted down in the US at this stage also.
So something else that happened around this time that you know, I always found odd looking at the relationship between the United States and Russia was just the reemergence of a Cold War, essentially the start of a new Cold War. And it was odd because through the 2000s, it seemed, you know, through the 1990s and 2000s, it seemed as though the US and Russia had a pretty amicable relationship. Bill Clinton got along with Boris Yeltsin pretty well. George W. Bush got along with Vladimir Putin seemingly through his administration. And even in the 2012 election, you had a bit of a controversy where Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, said that Russia was our #1 geopolitical foe. And Barack Obama pushed back against that, said that that was a perspective from the 1980s. And even John Kerry, again, he made a joke about this at the Democratic Convention in 2012.
Every president of both parties for 60 years has worked for nuclear arms control, but not Mitt Romney. Republican secretaries of state, from Kissinger to Baker, Powell to Rice, President Bush, 71 United States senators all supported President Obama's New START treaty, but not Mitt Romney. He's even blurted out the preposterous notion that Russia is our #1 geopolitical foe. Folks, Sarah Palin said she could see Russia from Alaska. Mitt Romney talks like he's only seen Russia by watching Rocky IV. I tell you. So here's the choice. Here's the choice in 2012. Mitt Romney, out of touch at home, out of his depth abroad, and out of the mainstream, or Barack Obama.
However, immediately following this, you had what happened in Ukraine, and again, just seemingly going right back to not just the 1980s, but the 1950s with this rivalry between the West and Russia. Do you have any thoughts on why this, and also everything that happened, you know, with Syria kind of coincided at the same time? I mean, was there some change of the guard in the United States government as far as, you know, Hillary Clinton, I guess, maybe coming to power in the State Department in 2009, or just like why did things seemingly change around this time period?
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. And of course, Russia then decided, after discussions actually with General Soleimani in 2015, to intervene. They had been militarily intervene in Syria. Of course, Russia has had its naval military base in Tartus for the last 60 years. This isn't anything, you know, this isn't new, let's say. So Russia for a long time had been, as you can see, even looking back over the 75 years, it had been an ally of Syria, and Syria had, let's say, sacrificed the Qatari or refused the Qatari pipeline on the basis that it didn't want to upset Russia and it would prefer to go. I mean, that was a statement that was actually made. We don't want to upset our ally in Russia by going along with this pipeline. So, you know, the collaboration between Syria and Russia is a historic one. But you're absolutely right in saying that all of these events kind of coincided. It could be that the kind of perceived friendliness towards Russia was based on the fact that they were not going to intervene in Syria. But then with the American interference in Ukraine, and of course then Crimea and the Kiev neo-Nazi attacks on Donbass region and so on and so forth, I think that demonstrated to Russia that any kind of ostensible friendship was not real, because of course Ukraine is directly on the borders with Russia. The other countries that border Russia are under effectively NATO occupation, apart from Belarus, which of course leads us to what's happening now in Belarus also, but I mean that's another subject. But effectively I think Russia recognized the fact that not only was the US pressurizing Russian borders, but of course a number of the armed groups that were being financed and supported by the Gulf states and America were Chechen. So they were also a threat to Russia in the future. So I think all of this played a role in Russia eventually deciding to militarily intervene to effectively save Syria from being overrun by terrorism, because 2013, 2014 were very dangerous tipping points for Syria. The Syrian Arab Army was hugely stretched on multiple fronts. It couldn't defend all of them. And we know under Obama, the train and equip program, you know, $100,000 per Muslim Brotherhood criminal thug to train these so-called moderate rebels that even at the time, Robert Ford, who was then US ambassador to Syria and of course was responsible for very much so for the creation of the death squads, very similar to what happened in Nicaragua, etc. And at the time, it was clear that the Free Syrian Army, which was the kind of so-called moderates, were collaborating with ISIS. The reason that the US has a military footprint inside Syria is, of course, in theory, to eradicate ISIS. And so I think, you know, Russia came in out of self-interest. It saw, because of the US in Ukraine and because of the power multiplying of terrorist groups that posed a threat to Russia and to Iran, of course. You know, Iran had a very similar reaction because it perceived that, and China, because there's a huge number of Uyghur terrorists fighting now in Idlib that have the potential to go back to Xinjiang province in China and to carry out further extremist attacks on the Chinese mainland. So, you know, I think all of these countries had a vested interest in preventing the spilling out of terrorists from their own nations outside Syria. So the intervention from Russia came in September 2015, finally.
And I think that one thing that did turn public sentiment against interfering in Syria more was the fact that it was revealed that the CIA was essentially arming ISIS, and there were stories about how there were essentially two sides of the war that the U.S. was supporting, fighting each other, with the State Department backing the Kurds and the CIA backing ISIS. At the same time, you know, the U.S. has, you know, seemingly bombed ISIS and fought ISIS. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Was it just the fact that the U.S. was supporting both sides in order to disrupt Syria? And if that's the case, why did the U.S. government, you know, seemingly defeat ISIS or, you know, push them back to such a large extent? Why wouldn't we have kept supporting them and kept them strong?
You have kept them strong. This is something that is really not reported in Western media at all. but it's a very well-known fact in Syria, and I've visited areas where civilians have told me, not military. Military have also informed me, but civilians have told me that it's a regular occurrence that you will see US helicopters ferrying ISIS fighters, in particular from different areas of the northeast, to carry out attacks on Syrian Arab Army, to lay IEDs on road routes out of the northeast, particularly those carrying what little oil is allowed into the Syria that is under the control of the Syrian government. Al-Tanf, which is one of the biggest of the illegal US military bases in Syria, in the southeast on the border with Jordan, is a training and recruitment center for ISIS and other extremist armed groups. The US has imposed a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around that camp, and within that exclusion zone, they run artillery and military exercises with the armed groups, including ISIS. Rukban camp, which is termed a refugee camp, is another recruitment center to the south of Al-Tanf. ISIS holding camps in Syria in the northeast. An expansion of those holding camps is being funded by the UK. And the US is effectively, on a regular basis, ferrying ISIS fighters from Syria to Iraq, where they are re-equipped and retrained if necessary, or even probably treated for any injuries that they have, and then they're ferried back by US helicopters or US convoys into the northeast, as I say, to carry on the attacks against Syrian Arab Army and Russian positions. But of course, Russia has a considerable military presence in the northeast, and it's worth noting that Russia has recently reinforced one of its military bases there with air defense systems, including the S-400. So everyone that claims that the S-300s are not present in Syria, they are present in Syria. But Syria is not revealing their placements until, because there is a very strong potential of an escalation of conflict with Israel. We've seen recently Israel attacking multiple times in the last few weeks in an attempt to disable Syrian air defense points, particularly to the west of Damascus, where I am. I was actually 100 meters away from the last Israeli attack on the airbase because they attacked during the daytime, which is unusual. So the US, I mean, even Kerry, I think John Kerry in the 2016 closed sessions in the UN admitted that the US had allowed the ISIS to flourish in order to topple the Syrian government. But now that kind of collaboration between ISIS and the US is far more blatant, even than it was under the Trump administration. Under the Biden administration, it's brazen. And let's not forget that, you know, ISIS was benefiting from the oil revenue for a long time before the Kurdish Contras took over from ISIS. We also have evidence and documentation of collaboration between the SDF, the Kurdish separatists, and ISIS. And for example, when you talk about the targeting of ISIS, we talked about Raqqa very early on. In reality, even if you read the Amnesty International report, the Kurdish factions were giving the US coordinates of civilian and residential areas, not of areas containing ISIS. Raqqa was about an ethnic cleansing pogrom, as was the majority of the Northeast. And who benefits from this ethnic cleansing? Not only the US, but Israel. You know, and then we go back to the Yinon plan, right? So the Northeast is strategically very important to the United States, to Turkey, and to Israel. And for that reason, ISIS has been weaponized. ISIS is the reason, it's the pretext for the American military footprint, the illegal military footprint, which is occupying through its proxies or directly Syrian oil resources. And you will see American convoys on an almost weekly basis of upwards of 200 vehicles sometimes, taking the oil out through one of their border crossings into Iraq and then trading the oil to Israel, of course, And let's not forget that Erdogan's son, Bilal, was exposed inside Turkey of trading Syrian oil with Israel early on in the conflict.
So when you say that the collaboration between the Biden administration and ISIS is more blatant, what do you mean by that?
I don't think they're hiding it. I think under Trump, there was still a degree of, we're here, I mean, Trump was all about bluster. We defeated ISIS. ISIS is gone. We've eradicated ISIS. The second that Biden came into was president-elect, right? He started bombing the Northeast. If you remember, he hit the Al-Bukamal crossing, which is the main border crossing that's still open between Iraq and Syria. So it allows some degree of trade between Iraq and Syria, remembering that Syria is effectively under blockade, both through economic sanctions and through the insecurity of its borders. The Northeast is effectively controlled by the US and its proxies, and Bukamal is one of the few crossings that is under the control of Hashd al-Shabi, which is considered an Iranian proxy. In reality, it's an Iraqi militia that has been responsible for the real defeat of ISIS inside Iraq and on the Syrian border. So under Biden, we saw almost immediately attacks by ISIS on electrical installations, for example, power and electricity installations in northeast Syria, but also in Iraq. ISIS has taken responsibility for attacks on electricity stations in Iraq. And we know that this is part of the multi-spectrum war waged by the US. For example, this happened in Iraq throughout both Gulf wars, or both wars against Iraq. But in Syria, it's been a strategy to destroy civilian infrastructure, to destroy waterways, bridges, electrical power stations, to completely deprive the Syrian people of resources. We don't have electricity. I have 1.5 hours every 4.5 hours, right? And I'm in Damascus, the capital city. In the next suburb, they're lucky if they get 2 hours per day. Why? Because the US has destroyed electricity installations, or rather its proxies have, or it's done so directly. And now, of course, what happened under Trump was very much, as I say, the economic bludgeon. He brought in the Caesar sanctions. He led the scorched earth policy by burning Syrian wheat crops throughout the country, not only in the northeast, but universally in Syria. And now, of course, we have the introduction of the Monsanto GMO seeds. I mean, this is another kind of aspect of this multi-spectrum war. They've burned all of the Syrian crops. Now they're introducing genetically modified seed to replace those crops. So, people need to understand the deviousness and the barbarism of these multi-spectrum wars. They're waged on every single level. But under Biden, I think it's become much more apparent that the US is effectively working with ISIS. It's not fighting ISIS.
One reason why I think the left in the United States, and perhaps in other countries as well, seems to support US imperialism in Syria is because of the Kurds, and specifically the supposed anarchist project that's happening among the Kurds. And the YPG and the PKK. So I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this, and just on the Kurds overall. Should they have their own nation state that they seem to be fighting for? Should they be allowed their own area to experiment with different forms of political organization? What do you think should happen, I guess, with the Kurds?
But it's not for me to say what would happen. That's up to Syria to decide. And but under international law, I would defend the territorial integrity of any nation that's under attack from the US coalition. And that's the most important aspect of this. But if we look, and I'll try to condense it down, But one of the reasons that the US initially imposed sanctions on Syria was for its supposed support of the PKK, which then was designated a terrorist organization. Interestingly, as you mentioned in 2014, I think it was that Kerry mentioned Plan B, which was the partitioning of Syria. And as I've mentioned, the Kurdish project in Syria is very much supported by Israel, because that complies with their Yinon plan, and even with the clean break strategy, which was to partition Syria into statelets that would be divided on sectarian lines and would be forever waging war against each other. That was, to weaken and destabilize the country, which is
I believe
part of a blueprint.
I believe when Joe Biden ran for president in 2008, he actually ran on the idea of doing that to Iraq and having a Sunni Iraq, a Shia Iraq, and a Kurdish Iraq.
Yeah, and in Yemen. Many people don't realize that just prior to March 2015, the Saudi plan was to divide it into, I think it was 7 statelets, isolating Ansarullah or the Houthi factions in a landlocked statelet. Anyway, so yeah, this entire partitioning, which of course the blueprint, if we go back to former Yugoslavia, that's where the blueprint for this whole partitioning exercise probably comes from, right? Although you can argue Sykes-Picot, et cetera, did the same thing by breaking up the Middle East into different states. Look, the Kurds are less than the Kurds. Saying the Kurds is anyway a misnomer, because the Kurds consist of various factions, various faiths and sects. For example, you can have Sunni Kurds, you can have Shia Kurds, etc. Right? The Kurds in Syria are less than 10% of the overall population. In the northeast, they are a minority in the northeast. So it's an area of Syria that is dominated by Assyrians, and by Syrians and by Arabs, by the kind of the Bedouin tribes. The Kurds are a minority. But even within the Kurdish communities, the Kurdish separatists are also a minority, okay? And the majority of the YPG consist of PKK, that's a fact. So effectively what was once designated a terrorist organization by the US is now being weaponized to effectively partition Syria and to separate the oil-rich region from the rest of Syria, which is exactly what they did with Iraqi Kurdistan. If you look at the history of Iraqi Kurdistan, it didn't have sanctions imposed on it. Why? Because it controlled the majority of the oil in Iraq once it was created as such. Now, many people will argue that the Kurdish factions defended northeast Syria. That's actually not true. They didn't. According to locals, particularly in the northeast, the Kurds attacked the Syrian Arab army positions that were left, for example, in Hasaka in 2016. I was speaking with a journalist friend of mine that was holed up in Hasaka with the military and under attack from the Kurds. So the Kurds turned against the Syrian Arab army, of course, encouraged and incentivized by the US. And yes, the entire marketing campaign of this kind of anarchist Rojava really, I remember, was it an article in Rolling Stone about them? It was extraordinary. So this entire concept, yes, you're right, has been sold to the left in the West. But, and I argued this point when I did a speaking tour in Iceland, because actually a lot of Icelanders, even some went to fight with the Kurds in northeast Syria. But also, you have to remember in Afrin, for example, in northern Syria, the Kurdish factions there refused Syrian Arab army collaboration to prevent a Turkish invasion in 2018. And as a result, they were ethnically cleansed from Afrin because they didn't allow the Syrian Arab army in to help them defend themselves against the Turkish invasion, and they were ethnically cleansed from Afrin. And they're in discussions, they're in negotiations now with Damascus, interestingly. There has been a major détente. The Kurds have lifted a number of the checkpoints in strategic areas in Qarmishli and Hasaka. But of course, the US is pushing back. On Saturday, US State Department officials came to northeast Syria to re-persuade the Kurds to stick with the US and Israel. It's very important to keep mentioning Israel here, and to not go back and negotiate with Syria and Damascus. So, in my view, Damascus is perfectly prepared to negotiate terms with the Kurdish separatists. But many of the Kurdish communities in Syria do not support separatism. They do not support partitioning of Syria. They have remained loyal to Syria and to Syrian territorial integrity. So it's complicated. But I think what people, and particularly on the left, have forgotten is that they should be defending international law. They shouldn't be defending a cause which is being amplified and made kind of sexy by Western media. This should be the first alarm bell to them, because any cause that is genuinely anti-imperialist is going to be deplatformed, it's going to be censored, it's going to be demonized, criminalized, or infiltrated, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've just seen that repeatedly, with progressive media. There's been a lot of debate around the Young Turks recently, and just going back and looking at how Cenk Uyghur's position on Syria has been all over the map. But since the Katzenberg money, he has been, staunchly against the Syrian government. And again, you see kind of echoes of this, maybe to a softer degree in Democracy Now! I don't know if you saw my interview with Howie Hawkins, who is the Green Party nominee in 2020.
No, I saw the one with Cynthia yesterday, which was great, but I didn't see that.
Yeah, and what shocked me during my interview with him was not only did he embrace the Russiagate conspiracy theory and this neo-McCarthyist rhetoric, which was amazing because it was employed against Jill Stein in 2016, but also, he kind of echoed this soft imperialism against Assad, and seemingly in favor of, again, I think because he comes from maybe an anarchist background, and the same thing happened when Noam Chomsky was on my show a couple of years ago. He stated that U.S. forces should be supporting the Kurds against Turkey, is what he was saying in that interview. But it's just odd to see all of these different people from across the left seemingly supporting U.S. imperialism. Maybe saying we shouldn't bomb Syria, but we should have troops there. And we also saw this too when Trump pulled out troops from Syria as well. There was, I don't know if you know of Mike Gravel. He was a former U.S. senator who was running for president, and he was an elderly man and didn't actually run his Twitter account. And his campaign staff misrepresented him on several occasions. One of them was that when Trump pulled out troops from, seemingly pulled out some troops from Syria, his campaign staff tweeted out that this was a terrible thing, when in actuality, Mike Gravel was in support of this. But I guess my point is, we're just seeing this prevalent across the left, where it seems as though the left is being conditioned to support U.S. imperialism, specifically in Syria.
Absolutely, and I think the concepts that are being sold have been very, very effective in gaslighting people into believing that some degree of imperialism is good. And that's where I have, my objection to let's say leftists as such, in inverted commas, saying, intervention is bad, and we shouldn't be arming terrorists in Syria. But hey, Syria is still a police state, it's still undemocratic, it's still authoritarian, etc., without context. Because as I demonstrated, I hope, in the article that I wrote, and that's why I wrote it, because I desperately want people to understand there's a massive amount of context. And you can't just make these kind of statements unless you're willing to discuss and analyze the context around it. For example, let's take the idea of political prisoners. This is another weapon that's been used against Syria by the so-called humanitarian NGO complex, which of course we know to be directly linked to intelligence agencies, both in the UK and in the US. And they've weaponized this kind of political prisoner construct against the Syrian government. But if we go back to 2001 to 2004, for example, so immediately after President Assad came to power in Syria, even Amnesty International, opposition legal experts like Anwar Bunni said that at this point there were only 2,000 so-called political prisoners in Syrian jails. Assad, or that was the maximum number. It varied between organizations and NGO reports, etc. And Assad basically released, I think it was between 600 and 900 of those. And in reality, by 2004, there were less than 600 political prisoners. Now, I asked people in the US, how many political dissidents are in jail in the US? How many Black and Latinos Americans are killed or wrongfully arrested or persecuted by American police every year, right? So less than 600 political prisoners. And putting that into context, that's immediately after the CIA weaponized the Muslim Brotherhood. So these are the political prisoners, right? So political prisoners is kind of, you know, it's a bit of an anodyne label to put on what were effectively extremist groups that carried out atrocities against Syrian civilians. And so, yes, they were imprisoned. Since 2011, those that are in prison are extremists. In Sadnaya, for example, in the kind of notorious report that was produced by Amnesty International that they had to backpedal on because basically they produced all of the evidence on the computer in London, right? And it was immediately dismissed even by former dissidents, former prisoners in Sadnaya who dismissed the entire report. So they had to backpedal on that one. But the people of Sadnaya would tell you, if anyone bothered to speak to them, that, yeah, there are prisoners in Sadnaya, but they are some of the worst and most brutal and most savage Al-Qaeda affiliates that have operated in Syria since 2011. So these, you know, you can't be using labels that effectively align with CIA narratives unless you can evidence them without using CIA produced reports, right? Whether it's from New York Times, whether it's from Amnesty International, whether it's the Caesar report, which was commissioned by Qatar through Carter Ruck, right? You know, we're going back to the Kuwaiti babies, we're going back to weapons of mass destruction, the Benghazi rape stories, etc. You know, we in the left, we have to start learning from history, and we have to start drawing on history in our discourse, and we have to be prepared. And that's where, you know, I'm incredibly grateful to you because I reached out to you and you invited me on and we've had the discussion. And this is what we should be doing on the left. Even if people challenge our conclusions, we should be prepared to be challenged. If somebody challenges me about the white helmets and can prove to me that they've been really rescuing civilians for the last 10 years, I will put my hands up and say, okay, I was completely wrong. You've produced the evidence, you've produced a viable argument, I can reconsider my conclusions. That's what we should be doing publicly, you know, and that's where you do a great job, where people like Ryan Christian do a fantastic job, because you're prepared to challenge your own boundaries, to challenge your own conclusions, and to challenge your own understanding of a situation. That's what we have to be doing all the time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. One question that I guess I had, you know, in regards to the left and, you know, being sufficiently anti-imperialist is I've seen some folks who, you know, I think have done a good job pushing back against claims about chemical weapons attacks and whatnot. You seem to have taken issue with a few of those. Caitlin Johnstone, for example, Jackson Hinkle. And I think that Jackson Hinkle, I believe, was specifically in regards to when he was debating Vosh, and he was making the argument that in Duma there was not a chemical weapons attack. So in my mind, like these are good faith actors, but it seems as though, you know, I guess maybe they adopted some imperialist talking points in your view, and I guess I'm just trying to understand what you were objecting to from them specifically, and maybe some others on the left who, you know, would say that they are being anti-imperialist and that they are pushing back on CIA propaganda.
I don't think you can claim to be anti-imperialist when you are towing the imperialist line as regards narratives, and you're towing it without evidence and without context. I mean, if we're going to talk about individuals, if we look at Jackson Hinkle, I mean, again, he didn't respond to challenges to his conclusions, right? And this is where I'm disappointed, because he was approached by Syrians who wanted to talk to him about their own state and how they would argue it's not a police state. Kivok Almasyan is one that approached him very civilly and said, hey, come on, let's sit down and talk about it. That offer wasn't taken up. And that's what I'm saying. If you're going to be echoing CIA talking points, MI6 talking points, that at the end of the day provided pretext for the war against Syria in the first place, then you have to be able to provide context that hasn't been produced by CIA-affiliated organizations, right? Because that's the only evidence of that that's out there, or anecdotal evidence from, I spoke to a Syrian and he told me, etc. No, that doesn't count, right? You have to be able to provide the historical context, or you have to be prepared to debate it. And if you're not prepared to debate it, you can't leave something which a lot of people consider to be misrepresenting Syria and doing damage to Syria. Effectively, those narratives have been responsible for the devastation here in Syria. And I take it personally because I've lived here for 2 years. So I see what those narratives do to the Syrian people. And I think we on the left have a responsibility to be brave in our reporting and our analysis. What it smacks to me of is it's okay to defend a narrative which isn't going to put you at risk, right? The OPCW is an open and shut case, to be honest. You have whistleblowers that came forward and discredited the OPCW report, right? But you have to be able to effectively either defend your position on Syria or attack the imperialist position on Syria with historical evidence, and that's what they're not doing. So to me, it smacks of brand protection. In other words, you're going so far to fight against the imperialist construct, but when it gets to a point where it's a little bit risky, and you're going to end up being called an Assadist, you're going to end up being attacked by the media complex, like the Young Turks. I mean, for goodness sake, people like myself and Shameen Nawani and Eva Bartlett have been attacked and smeared consistently for the last 5 years. Why? Because we don't accept any of the narratives unless we ourselves have investigated them, analyzed them, and in most cases come back with the evidence that disproves them. So what I'm saying is, please, as leftist journalists, thank you for everything that you've done to expose certain elements of the imperialist war against Syria. But don't stop there, because while you leave elements kind of alive and you have Chomsky coming on and saying, yeah, but Assad's a monster. No, he's not a monster. How can he be described as a monster when millions of people came on the streets in May of this year to vote for him? And it's none of our business. Even if he were the worst monster on the planet, it's none of our business if the Syrian people choose him over any other viable opposition leader inside Syria. I mean, that's another whole discussion. But what I'm saying is Syria deserves more from the left. It didn't have any support at the start of this war. It's had very little support through the majority of this war. And now the war is over. And now the West is effectively normalizing relations with President Assad because it realizes that nothing it's thrown at Syria has succeeded. People are kind of coming on board, but don't come on board half-heartedly, come on board fully. Look into the narratives that you're currently supporting. Decide for yourself if you think they're true. Come to Syria. Come to Syria and speak to Syrians, or speak to Syrians that are offering to debate you. Expand the argument. Don't keep it in this CIA echo chamber, because that's what's happening. And so people are kind of dismissing it, going, yeah, but it's a police state. Yeah, but Assad's still a monster. Yeah, but it's still a... You see what I'm saying? People are not progressing because these commentators are not giving them the space to progress into. And I think that's what is very, very, very important to do. We as journalists have a responsibility to do that. So I'm not attacking these commentators, but I'm saying, please just expand your discussions, expand your own knowledge. Jackson Hinkle was 10 when the war started in Syria. Come on, dude, like, speak to Syrians. Speak to people that have actually been here on the front lines during the conflict, that really do understand what's going on here.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, there has to be, everybody kind of grows and evolves, right?
Yeah, sure.
And also, too, I mean, just to, you know, Jackson Hinkle was called an Assadist. Like, when Vosh put up his video, he called him an Assadist because he was saying that there wasn't chemical weapons attack. I'm sure that Caitlin Johnstone has probably been accused of being an Assadist or taking money from Assad. So, I mean, I guess it's just a matter of where you draw the line, right? Because from my perspective, you know, if you're pushing back on these chemical weapons claims, and obviously the OPCW has been discredited, but, you know, you still have people, again, like Vosh, who are saying that there were chemical weapons attacks. Even Chomsky, he said that he, you know, wanted OPCW to release the full notes on the whistleblowers, but he still was saying that Assad probably committed a chemical weapons attack. So, you know, this is still very prevalent, even amongst the left wing. I would say the majority of leftists probably in the United States would probably say that there was chemical weapons attacks. So I think even having somebody pushing back on that, I mean, isn't that sufficient, or is really, you know, still thinking that Assad has cracked down on civilians or you know, bomb civilians or whatnot apart from chemical weapons? Is that just too imperialist?
I think it's a case of looking for the truth, isn't it, Primo? Like, you know, if you take every single one of these narratives and you genuinely investigate it, you will find that the majority of them are not true, right? And what I'm saying is expand the discussion. If you're talking about crackdown on civilians, I told you in the beginning, for the first 6 months, the security forces didn't carry weapons. The majority of the casualties were among security forces. I produced a documentary called The Veto, which covers the early protests, the incentivization of the early protesters, the paying of money to people to go out on the streets, et cetera, et cetera. So the crackdown narrative has no legs. When you actually look into it, when you come here and talk to Syrians, when you talk to analysts that have visited Syria, that have actually produced the evidence that shows that the crackdown was a narrative produced by the West to demonize the Syrian government. Chemical weapons was a narrative produced by the West to demonize the Syrian government. Political prisoners, I've demonstrated, is an exaggeration or it's a misrepresentation of facts to influence people against the Syrian government. The fact that Syria is a police state is denied by the majority of Syrians inside Syria. So no, it's not about is it anti-imperialist enough. I'm saying if you're going to be commentating on a geopolitical, a very, a pivotal geopolitical war or situation, you have the responsibility to inform yourself. And if you can't inform yourself, to bring on people, as you do, as many genuine presenters do, to inform your audience. Otherwise, as I said, you're maintaining the narratives that enabled the war in the first place. And if you have an influence, you have a responsibility. And, even if you are not prepared to do it, why not debate civilly with people that have an alternative view to yourself? That's my point. Let's open up the discussion. Let's expand the discussion. Let's not keep it in this kind of vortex of disinformation, as I see it, disinformation that can be used against the Syrian government in the future. It can be used to maintain sanctions. It can be used to potentially create another insurgency in the future. So we have a responsibility to prevent what happened to Syria for 10 years happening again. And that is where my priorities lie. My behind trying to break down every single narrative and to provide context is the Syrian people. They've suffered too much and they don't deserve this suffering. It's not about President Assad. It's not about one man. It's about the millions of Syrians that now live below the poverty level, that have had their infrastructure destroyed, their homes destroyed, their entire way of life destroyed, their peace, stability and security destroyed, that they never questioned prior to 2011. Syria was a developing, progressive, reformist country. And it had peace and stability that was the envy of every country in the Middle East. The Syrian people did not deserve this war, and we as commentators and as anti-war journalists need to be expanding the discussion to demonstrate the disinformation that has been used to bring about the devastation of the Syrian people. That is my point. So I'm not attacking individuals per se. If you like, I'm saying to them, I'm challenging them. Bring me on to challenge your conclusions. Bring Kivok Almasyan on, bring Eva Bartlett on, bring Sharmin Nawani on, bring people on that will challenge your conclusions and will open up the debate to your audiences and hopefully inform and educate them. That's what we should be doing.
So Aaron Mate, for example, somebody who went to Syria and reported on what happened on the ground there, and again, who has been called an Assadist for debunking these chemical weapons attacks, namely by TYT. Is he doing a good job?
I would love Aaron to get me on to discuss his conclusions about Syria. I mean, at the end of the day, Aaron came into Syria for about 5 days when the war was over. As part of a delegation, which is cool. It's really good that he came to Syria, but I would still like to sit down and debate his conclusions about Syria being a police state, etc. when he left. It's not, I don't want to, you're kind of making this personal, Primo. I don't want to make it personal. What I'm saying is what we as journalists should be doing, and I think we're failing to do that in some instances. And I would like to see that change. I would like to see the Aaron Mate's getting people like Kivok Almasyan on to debate the history of Syria as a Syrian, right? As someone that's been covering the war against Syria from the very beginning. And who has a very alternative view to Jackson Hinkle and Aaron Mate. Why not bring him on? Why does the narrative have to be kept, if you like, in a form of echo chamber? Why can't it be made bigger? Why can't it be more expansive, more inclusive of other views? That's my point. I'm not going to make this personal. It's not a personal attack on anyone. My priority is getting the truth out there, fighting the disinformation. I believe a lot of the narratives that are being supported by certain people, commentators on the left, are disinformation. And I would like the opportunity to talk about it. Thank you to you for giving it to me. And I hope that others will follow suit.
So I know we've gone over 90 minutes now. I did just want to talk briefly with you about COVID, because I know that you've been pushing back on that propaganda a bit. One question I guess I just had was in regards to Syria. What has been the response to COVID in Syria? Were there ever any lockdowns or masking laws, or what's the status of vaccines and whatnot in Syria?
Syria from the start, because I actually moved here in October 2019. Initially, there was a curfew, which I think was from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. That was for about a month or 6 weeks. Kids were pulled out of school. But after the initial curfew, the president made the announcement that the curfew would be lifted because he considered that the curfew was doing greater damage to the country and to the economy than a virus. And from then on in, there is no mandatory masking. The majority of people are not wearing masks, and they never have done. There has never really been any social distancing. I mean, there were recommendations put out by the government. A health committee formed in order to combat the effects of the virus and so on. And I wrote a couple of articles. I think one of them was for Mint Press News, talking about how the effects of COVID combined with the multi-spectrum war against Syria, etc., increased the blockade and the sense of siege here in Syria. But effectively, no vaccines are recommended, but not mandatory. There is no talk of mandatory vaccination or vaccination passports, etc., as is being discussed in the West. So there's no segregation of unvaxxed from vaxxed. Discussions here are very amiable about the whole thing. If, for example, I enter a shop and somebody's wearing a mask, nobody has a go at me for not wearing a mask. And as I said, the majority of people are not wearing masks at all. I think, people in Syria, after 10 years war and the sanctions and the political pressure, etc., have a lot more to worry about than COVID. And that's in a country which is really effectively immune suppressed, because we struggle with water supply, we struggle with electricity, so heating in the winter and air conditioning in the summer is not available, etc. People are living in really dire conditions in areas that were occupied by the armed groups and very much destroyed in the campaigns to liberate those areas. And numbers are pretty low. I haven't got the latest actual recorded numbers to hand, but they're relatively low. And of course, they're also being ramped up in Idlib in particular, on the basis that the white helmets, which most people should know is a American and British intelligence construct created in 2013, working exclusively with the armed groups, is now being funded on the basis that it's producing PPE in Idlib for the corona crisis. So, Syria is dealing with it in a very practical, rational manner, which is not what I could say for the majority of Western countries.
Yeah, I mean, we just had the news breaking that the unvaccinated are going to be essentially kept out of the rest of society and locked down in Austria. And now there's the prospect of that happening one way or another, whether that's directly in that kind of manner, or with vaccine passports not being able to go certain places. What do you think is going to be the likely outcome of all of this? Do you think that we're just going to see the world go to a really dystopian place and people just kind of, slowly over time, the frog being boiled here? Or do you think that there is going to be a massive pushback like what we're seeing in Australia, where people are just going to say, we're not going to cooperate?
That's what I hope will happen. Because, I mean, ultimately, that's what it's down to. It's people actually saying no to these measures. And I said right at the beginning that the multi-spectrum war that has been waged against these target nations for the imperialist construct, those multi-spectrum wars are now being waged against us, or rather against Western or global North populations. Enforced food shortages, the lockdowns, which have created depression and poverty in the working class, effectively, not in the mid class and the elite classes. In fact, they've benefited from it. Companies like Amazon are rolling in the profits. So yeah,
I literally cannot drive anywhere now without seeing an Amazon.
Yeah, this is the thing. it's scary. I mean, we are facing a pretty dystopian future. It's a very bleak future. And, when you had Chomsky on, and I think he woke quite a few people up, actually, by kind of basically saying, yeah, well, if you don't want to be vaccinated, you should be segregated and starved. I mean, that's fundamentally what he said, right? And I think a lot of people were like, really? And I think even people that have chosen, and my position is, I'm not against vaccinations. I'm not anti-vax, as they like to describe all of us as, but I do have concerns over an experimental drug that is proving not to be a vaccine. It's proving not to be effective. It's proving not to provide any immunity whatsoever. And it's the statistics of adverse reactions and deaths are absolutely monumental. We're only seeing a small percentage of those that are being reported, but nobody's seeing it as an alarm bell to withdraw the product from the market, which is what should be happening, right? With this number of adverse reactions and deaths from the vaccines themselves. And of course, Big Pharma has no liability in this. It's not liable to prosecution for any injury or damage done to people through the vaccination. And so I think even those that have been vaccinated should be standing up for the rights of those that don't want to be vaccinated. Everyone should be standing up against mandatory health measures, because right now you might agree with a COVID vaccine being made mandatory, but down the road, because you've accepted this, you don't know what's going to be made mandatory in the future that you might disagree with. So this is about a principle, right? All of this is about a principle. It's about whether you're prepared to have every aspect of your life controlled and surveilled in the future, or whether you're going to say no now and prevent it. And you talked about Australia, but there are massive protests throughout the EU, particularly in France, now in the UK, and people are pushing back. And I hope that the pushback is going to be successful. Certainly, I think we'll probably see an evolution from the pandemic to climate change to start to bring in, greater control measures and surveillance measures, etc. And people should remember, we saw all this after 9/11, the war on terror, that introduced a number of draconian measures to security at airports, etc., that we were told would be temporary. These measures are not temporary. If you don't say no now, they're here for life, right?
Well, Vanessa, I know that we've gone about twice as long as I said we would. Do you have a couple minutes left for a few patron questions?
Yeah, sure. Go for it. Yeah.
All right. I have 3 patron questions. The first one says, please tell us about your personal political evolution, particularly about your experience as you were demonized by mainstream media while being embraced by those who have lost faith in mainstream media. How has this helped and hurt your interpretation of events?
Good question. Well, as I mentioned to you, I mean, the smearing of people like myself and Eva and even Piers Robinson and Sharmin Nawani, who did probably the best job in the early years of the war against Syria. It has been an absolute maelstrom. I mean, when you have The Guardian and The Times, I think, on one particular Sunday produced 4 articles basically smearing me as an Assadist, and this was back in, I think it was 2018, and they cropped a photo of me meeting with President Assad with an American peace delegation, and they cropped all the other members out and just showed the picture of me with President Assad, to prove the point that I'm totally in with the presidency, etc. Initially, it was a bit of a shock to the system, but then I started to realize that actually, the more they attacked me, the more they actually drew attention to my work, and the more they probably inadvertently influenced public consensus to come around in favor of Syria and to understand that this was a regime change war. So actually, in the end, as I've said in other interviews, I'm kind of grateful that they did it, because probably it wasn't the desired outcome, but I think it raised awareness about what was really happening. Because people were, they recognized the fact, if someone writes one article about you attacking you, okay, there may be some credibility to it. But for example, Chris York of Huffington Post wrote, I think on the last count, 12 articles attacking me very personally over my Syria reporting. Brian Whitaker, formerly of The Guardian, suspected to be funded by Qatar now, I think at one point called me the goddess of propaganda. This was clearly the BBC most recently with the Mayday series. I mean, that was a 15 episode series, the majority of which was attacking me. It was followed by a 7,000 front page BBC website article attacking me, doxing my car in Syria. They actually published a picture of my car with the number plate showing. They only blurred out the number plate after I contacted them. So I think people recognize that this was a targeted campaign to silence voices that were presenting the truth about Syria from on the ground. And by the way, you mentioned Democracy Now! I really quickly want to mention something that happened in 2016. In 2016, I was probably the only Western journalist on the ground in Aleppo as it was being liberated. I was contacted on the recommendation of a friend of mine working for Democracy Now! By a Democracy Now! Producer. When I came back to her with what I had seen, she basically said to my colleague that, oh, we can't have her on because, I mean, she's going against, what everyone else is saying. Right? So this is,
that's the last thing you would want on Democracy.
Exactly. It was extraordinary. It couldn't be any more blatant. Like, no, we don't want her on because she's going to challenge the dominant narratives, right? The establishment narratives on Syria. Even though the UN produced a report a few months later that actually completely agreed with what I had said about what was going on in Aleppo. So I think in a cliched way, it's kind of character building. In another way, if I look at the positives, it increased public consensus in favor of Syria. So, I see it entirely as a positive.
There's another actually very similar patron question. Where do you find the strength to persevere in the face of unremitting hostility by the mainstream media and Western governments? So you're saying it's basically just they're essentially, empowering you by attacking you.
Yeah, and I think, when you can't unsee what you see here in Syria, you can't unsee or unhear the witness testimony that you receive about the atrocities committed. And some of them are literally unrepeatable on shows like yours, because I think people would, it's just too horrifying even for me. When I first started hearing some of these stories, you recoil in horror because you can't believe the satanic brutality that has been carried out against these civilians. And when you hear about these atrocities, when you witness them in some instances, when you live and move among the Syrian people, being attacked by Western media is kind of being ravaged by a Jack Russell. It's nothing in comparison. So in my view, you don't have a right to stop doing what you're doing if you believe in what you're doing.
So the final patron question, this is from John McCarthy in Chicago. Can you comment on China's efforts to integrate Syria into the Belt and Road Initiative? And if it's not too off topic, maybe also what their plans to do the same with Afghanistan and their opposition to killer sanctions anywhere in the world?
Well, I mean, China has been instrumental in preventing military intervention in Syria through the veto in the UN. That's number one. So China, although it hasn't effectively intervened militarily on behalf of Syria, although it is defending its interests because it doesn't want the kind of 20-odd thousand Uyghurs coming back to China. It prefers to get rid of them inside Syria, and they're all embedded in Idlib.
If you don't mind me asking, I'm sorry, I'm wondering, because this came up a couple times, how did this large number of Uyghurs get to Syria? Was it just a slow migration, or how did this happen?
Well, I mean, actually, there's a report that's just about to be published at ukcolumn.org, which, by the way, I recommend everybody follow for coronavirus project news in the UK. which explains that a lot of, for example, the Kurdish Salafists, and they do exist, have this ideology of converting all of the Kurdish communities in Syria to Sunni Islam, for example, and creating a kind of Kurdish caliphate. And the Uyghurs, I guess, ideologically have a very, they're very closely affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And this entire caliphate project is a major driver for many of these extremist Salafist groups, and the Uyghurs figure among those. A good person to follow on the history of the Uyghur movement, because I'm not an expert on it, is Daniel Birchall, I think it is. He has his own YouTube channel and he's really good on this subject. So I recommend people check him out. But so I would guess they ended up in Syria because ideologically they saw an opportunity to create a caliphate in Syria that perhaps they couldn't achieve in the Xinjiang province, although they have tried. And of course they are being heavily, let's say, weaponized by the US in the humanitarian narrative war against China, as we well know. So China has always considered Syria to be the hub, the central element, the cog in the wheel of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that was actually, I think it was the 5 Cs project of President Assad, was to incorporate the Belt and Road Initiative into Syria's own initiative to expand trade into Europe, etc. And that was another one of the reasons, of course, that Syria was targeted for regime change. So, yeah, I mean, China sees Syria as central to that project. And of course, that's one of the reasons that the Uyghur narrative is being used to criminalize China, because the Belt and Road Initiative directly challenges US hegemony in the region, of course. And China being against sanctions, well, I mean, in my view, everyone should be against sanctions, because actually they are never used as anything but as a weapon. And they are not supposed to be unilateral. That's illegal under international law, but of course they are always unilateral, as they have been in Iraq, in Syria for sure, in Yemen for sure. The original resolution in Yemen called for sanctions against 5 named individuals. It's effectively against 21 million Yemenis. So sanctions, as I said, in my view, everyone with a brain should be against sanctions, particularly in the hands of successive US administrations, because they're only ever used to punish a country that is not coming into line with US policy. Sanctions are not used against Saudi Arabia. Sanctions are not used against Israel. Sanctions are not used against despotic, tyrannical allies of the US. They're only used against perceived enemies of US policy in specific region.
Well, Vanessa, thank you again for being on the show today, and thank you for going a full 2 hours. I think this may have been the longest interview I've ever done, so I appreciate your time today. This is a great conversation. I appreciate you staying for the full length of the time that you had available. For folks out there who would like to support you and keep up to date with you, how can they do that?
They can go to my Patreon. I'm also on Rockfin and Subscribestar, so they can, and I would really appreciate anyone. $1 a month is great. That's all I need, just to keep doing what I'm doing.
Well, Vanessa, thank you again for being on the show today, and hopefully I can have you back at some point in the future.
Thanks a lot, Primo. It was really good to have the discussion. Thank you.